In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled under the weight of Allied advances from both east and west, Soviet forces racing through Germany made a discovery that would profoundly impact the future of aviation warfare. Among the abandoned factories, airfields, and research facilities, they found examples of what many considered the most advanced fighter aircraft of the entire war, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The story of how Soviet engineers came to test these revolutionary aircraft and what they discovered in the process reveals not just the technical brilliance and fatal flaws of German wartime engineering, but also provides a window into the early days of the Cold War arms race that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Me 262 represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. While Allied forces were still relying primarily on propeller-driven fighters, Germany had successfully fielded a jet-powered aircraft capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour, faster than any contemporary Allied fighter. The swept-wing design, twin turbojet engines, and heavy armament made it a fearsome interceptor, particularly against the massive bomber formations that were systematically destroying German industrial capacity. But the Me 262's development and deployment had been troubled from the very beginning. The aircraft first flew in July 1942, but didn't enter operational service until mid-1944, delayed by engine problems, material shortages, and interference from the highest levels of German leadership. Adolf Hitler himself had insisted that the aircraft be modified as a fast bomber, a decision that delayed its deployment as a pure fighter and arguably squandered its potential to inflict severe damage on Allied bombing campaigns. By the time the Me 262 reached combat units in meaningful numbers, Germany's situation was already desperate. Fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and vulnerability during takeoff and landing meant that, despite its technological superiority, the jet fighter could never achieve the impact its designers had envisioned. Nevertheless, in the hands of skilled pilots, the Me 262 proved devastatingly effective. Allied bomber crews learned to fear the distinctive roar of its Junkers UMO 004 engines and the sight of these sleek aircraft diving through formations at speeds no escort fighter could match. As Soviet forces pushed westward in early 1945, capturing German territory at an accelerating pace, Stalin's intelligence services had very specific orders. The supreme leader wanted Germany's advanced technology, and he wanted it intact. Soviet intelligence had been aware of the Me 262 program for some time through various sources, and capturing examples of this revolutionary aircraft became a top priority. The rapid Soviet advance created chaos in German-held territory. Luftwaffe units attempted to evacuate or destroy valuable equipment and aircraft, but the speed of the collapse meant that much fell into Soviet hands. At several locations, including airfields near Prague in eastern Germany and at former Messerschmitt facilities, Soviet troops discovered Me 262 aircraft in various states of completion. The prize find came at a factory complex where several nearly complete aircraft were discovered, along with spare engines, technical documentation, and even some of the German engineers who had worked on the project. For Stalin's aviation experts, this was an intelligence windfall of immense proportions. The Soviet Union had been working on its own jet engine programs, but these were still in early developmental stages. Access to a fully operational jet fighter, along with the technical knowledge behind it, could accelerate Soviet jet development by years. The captured aircraft and equipment were quickly transported eastward, along with German personnel whose expertise would prove invaluable. Some went willingly, seeing cooperation as preferable to uncertain fates in a defeated Germany. Others had little choice in the matter. The Soviet approach to acquiring foreign technology had always been pragmatic, and the chaos of the immediate post-war period created opportunities that would not last long. By summer 1945, The most intact Me-262 examples had arrived at Soviet aviation research facilities. The primary testing would take place at the Flight Research Institute, known by its Russian acronym LII, located near Moscow. This facility would become the center of Soviet efforts to understand and replicate jet technology. Teams of Soviet engineers, many of them brilliant minds who had been developing their own aircraft throughout the war, now had the opportunity to examine what was arguably the most advanced fighter aircraft in existence. The initial examinations revealed both the genius and the compromises inherent in the Me-262's design. Soviet engineers were immediately impressed by several aspects of the aircraft. The aerodynamic design showed sophisticated understanding of high-speed flight characteristics. The swept-wing design, while not extreme by later standards, represented advanced thinking about reducing drag at high subsonic speeds. The positioning of the engines and underwing nacelles was elegant and practical, making maintenance and replacement easier than if engines had been buried in the fuselage or wings. The aircraft's armament was formidable. 4 30mm cannons concentrated in the nose provided devastating firepower. Soviet pilots who would later test fly captured examples reported that the concentration of weapons and the jet speed made it a uniquely effective bomber-destroyer. Some Me-262 variants had been equipped with experimental rocket armament, and documentation on these systems was studied intensively. However, as Soviet engineers began more detailed examinations and initiated ground testing, they started to identify problems. Some of these issues were already known to German pilots and ground crews who had operated the type, but others emerged only through the systematic testing regime the Soviets employed. And one particular problem would prove to be far more severe than anyone had initially realized. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engine that powered the Me-262 was a remarkable achievement for its time, but Soviet engineers quickly recognized it was also a deeply compromised design. Germany's strategic situation had forced numerous shortcuts and substitutions in materials and manufacturing processes. The engine's turbine blades, which operated under extreme temperatures and stresses, were supposed to be made from heat-resistant alloys containing chromium and nickel. However, severe shortages of these strategic materials had forced German engineers to develop alternative alloys. The substitute materials used in production engines were significantly inferior. Soviet metallurgists analyzing the turbine blades found that their composition and heat treatment were inadequate for the sustained high temperatures of jet engine operation. This explained something German pilots had long known. The Jumo 04 engines had extremely short operational lifespans, typically 25 hours or less, before requiring complete replacement. By comparison, even early Allied jet engines achieved lifespans several times longer. But material deficiencies were just the beginning. As Soviet test pilots began flying the captured Me-262s, more problems emerged. The engines were notoriously temperamental. Throttle movements had to be made slowly and smoothly, as rapid throttle changes could cause compressor stalls, flameouts, or even catastrophic engine failures. Pilots needed extensive training to manage the engines properly, training that many Luftwaffe pilots in the war's final months simply didn't receive. The engines were also vulnerable to foreign object damage. Operating from damaged or improvised airfields, as German forces were increasingly forced to do, meant that debris ingestion was a constant risk. Soviet test reports documented how even small stones or debris could cause serious damage to the compressor blades, potentially leading to complete engine failure. These were serious problems, but Soviet engineers initially attributed them primarily to Germany's deteriorating industrial capacity and material shortages. The fundamental design, they believed, was sound. However, as testing continued and Soviet engineers conducted more detailed analysis, they began to identify a problem that went deeper than material substitutions or wartime manufacturing compromises. The critical discovery came during a series of high-altitude performance tests. Soviet test pilots were pushing the aircraft to its limits, exploring its performance envelope in ways that combat conditions didn't always allow. During one of these test flights, something unexpected happened. The pilot reported severe vibrations developing at high speed and altitude, vibrations that grew worse as speed increased. The test was aborted, and the aircraft returned to base for examination. Engineers initially suspected engine problems, but inspection revealed something different. The issue wasn't with the engines themselves, but with how the engines were mounted to the aircraft. The mounting system consisted of a complex arrangement of struts and supports designed to hold the heavy jet engines beneath the wings while allowing for thermal expansion and contraction during operation. What Soviet engineers discovered was that this mounting system had a fundamental dynamic instability. Under certain conditions of speed, altitude, and power setting, the engine mountings would begin to resonate. This wasn't simple vibration, but a phenomenon called flutter, an aerodynamic instability that could build rapidly and catastrophically. The swept-wing design and the weight and position of the engines created a situation where, at certain speeds, airflow patterns could induce oscillations in the engine nacelles. These oscillations would feed back into the wing structure and, under the right conditions, could amplify rapidly. German engineers had been aware that the mounting system was less than ideal, but wartime pressures had prevented a complete redesign. They had implemented certain restrictions on the aircraft's operational envelope to avoid the conditions where problems would occur. However, the Soviets were testing the aircraft more systematically and discovered that the problem was worse than the Germans had realized, or at least worse than their documentation indicated. Further investigation revealed the full scope of the issue. The engine mountings were experiencing metal fatigue at a much faster rate than designed. Stress analysis showed that even normal operational loads were causing microscopic cracking in critical mounting components. Over time, these cracks would propagate, and eventually, structural failure would occur. In several captured aircraft that had seen significant operational use, inspections revealed advanced fatigue damage that could have led to complete structural failure of the engine mounting, potentially resulting in an engine separating from the aircraft in flight. This was the catastrophic design error that Soviet engineers had discovered. The Me-262's engine mounting system was fundamentally flawed in a way that would have made the aircraft increasingly dangerous as operational hours accumulated. German pilots had rarely kept individual Me-262s in service long enough for this problem to manifest fully, primarily because the short engine life meant aircraft were frequently grounded for engine changes. But had the aircraft been available in larger numbers and operated more extensively, this structural problem could have resulted in numerous losses. Soviet engineers documented these findings in detailed technical reports. The analysis was thorough and revealing, showing not just the specific problem with the Me-262, but highlighting broader lessons about jet aircraft design that were still being learned in this early era of jet aviation. The placement of heavy vibrating engines on thin wing structures created challenges that propeller aircraft designers had never faced. The high speeds achievable by jets introduced new aerodynamic phenomena. The mounting systems needed to be far more robust than initial designs had assumed. These discoveries profoundly influenced Soviet jet aircraft development. The first generation of Soviet jets, including the MiG-9 and Yak-15, which flew in 1946, showed evidence of lessons learned from the Me-262 analysis. While these aircraft bore some superficial resemblance to the German jet, Soviet designers had made different choices in critical areas. Engine mounting systems were redesigned with greater attention to structural integrity and fatigue life. Testing protocols were expanded to more thoroughly explore flutter and resonance phenomena. The intelligence gained from captured Me-262 scades went beyond just identifying flaws. Soviet engineers were able to study advanced manufacturing techniques, learn about high-speed aerodynamics, and understand the challenges of jet engine integration. German documentation on the aircraft's development history revealed the blind alleys and failed approaches that German engineers had encountered, allowing Soviet designers to avoid repeating those mistakes. Some of the German engineers and technicians who had worked on the Me-262 program found themselves continuing their work in the Soviet Union, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not. Their knowledge and experience accelerated Soviet aviation development significantly. Design bureaus led by figures like Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich and Alexander Yakovlev benefited enormously from access to both the hardware and the human expertise captured from Germany. The Me-262 testing program also revealed important information about pilot training requirements for jet aircraft. Soviet test pilots who flew the Me-262 reported that the aircraft handled very differently from propeller fighters. The high speed and relatively poor low-speed handling meant that landing accidents were common. The long takeoff roll and slow acceleration made the aircraft vulnerable during these critical phases of flight. All of these lessons informed Soviet thinking about jet fighter operations and training requirements. Interestingly, while the Soviets were discovering the Me-262's structural flaws, British and American engineers were conducting their own evaluations of captured examples. The Western powers had captured Me-2 at various locations in Germany, and these aircraft were shipped to Britain and the United States for testing and evaluation. British test pilots at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough flew captured examples extensively, as did American pilots at Wright Field in Ohio. The Western evaluations identified many of the same problems the Soviets had found, including engine unreliability and mounting system weaknesses. However, the different testing philosophies and priorities meant that some issues were emphasized more by one side than another. The Soviets, planning for mass production and large-scale deployment of jet fighters, were particularly concerned about structural fatigue and long-term reliability issues. The Western powers, initially more interested in understanding the technology and its implications, focused somewhat more on performance characteristics and aerodynamic design. What's remarkable is how quickly jet technology evolved after the war, building on the foundation of wartime German research, but rapidly surpassing it. By 1950, just 5 years after the war's end, both the Soviet Union and Western powers were operating jet fighters that were substantially more capable and reliable than the Me-262. Aircraft like the Soviet MiG-15 and the American F-86 Sabre represented a new generation that had learned from and moved beyond the pioneering German designs. The structural problems discovered in the Me-262 foreshadowed challenges that would recur throughout early jet aviation development. The American F-84 Thunderjet suffered from wing structural problems in its early variants. The British de Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jet airliner, experienced catastrophic structural failures due to metal fatigue around cabin windows, leading to several tragic losses before the problem was understood and corrected. The fundamental challenges of operating at high speeds and altitudes with heavy, powerful engines generating significant vibration and stress took years to fully solve. Soviet engineers' documentation of the Me-262's flaws contributed to a more systematic approach to aircraft structural testing and certification. The concept of safe-life design, where components are replaced before fatigue failure becomes likely, and later fail-safe design, where structures are designed so that the failure of one component doesn't lead to catastrophic loss of the aircraft, both emerged partly from early jet-era experiences like the Me-262 evaluation. It's worth considering what might have happened if Germany had been able to deploy the Me-262 earlier and in greater numbers. Luftwaffe pilots who flew the type, including some of Germany's highest-scoring aces, were convinced that the aircraft could have had a significant impact on the air war if available in 1943 instead of late 1944. However, the structural problems discovered by Soviet engineers suggest that even if production and deployment had occurred earlier, the Me-262 might have faced a growing crisis of structural failures as operational hours accumulated. The German aviation industry in the war's final years was performing near miracles simply to keep any aircraft in production and operational. The systematic testing and quality control that would have identified and corrected the mounting system problems simply wasn't possible under wartime conditions. Engineers were solving immediate crises, not optimizing long-term reliability. The result was an aircraft that, while revolutionary, was fundamentally compromised in ways that would have limited its effectiveness even under more favorable circumstances. The Soviet testing program also examined the Me-262's potential for further development. Various captured documents revealed German plans for improved versions, including variants with more powerful engines, swept wings of greater angle, and even proposals for swept wing designs that approached transonic speeds. Soviet engineers evaluated these proposals in light of their own developing understanding of high-speed aerodynamics. Some of these German concepts influenced Soviet designs, but often in modified form. The lesson of the Me-262's structural problems made Soviet designers cautious about adopting German solutions wholesale. Instead, they took the concepts and reworked them, applying their own engineering principles and manufacturing capabilities. This approach proved successful, as Soviet jet fighters of the late 1940s and 1950s proved to be formidable aircraft that in many cases matched or exceeded contemporary Western designs. The human dimension of this story shouldn't be overlooked. German engineers who had poured their efforts into the Me-262 program, often under difficult and dangerous conditions, now saw their work being analyzed, critiqued, and ultimately used as a foundation for their former enemies' aviation programs. Some felt bitterness at how their work was being appropriated. Others, particularly those who cooperated with Soviet authorities, rationalized their continued work as simply doing what engineers do, solving technical problems regardless of political circumstances. Soviet test pilots who flew the Me-262 had complex reactions to the aircraft. They recognized its revolutionary nature and the engineering achievement it represented. At the same time, they were keenly aware of its flaws and limitations. Many of these pilots had flown combat missions against German forces and had seen friends lost to enemy action. Now they were flying German aircraft, learning its secrets, and in some cases, developing a grudging respect for their former adversaries' technical capabilities. The captured Me-262s continued to provide value to Soviet aviation development for several years after the war. Even as new Soviet-designed jets entered service, the German aircraft served as test beds and training aids. Test pilots used them to develop procedures and techniques for jet operations. Engineers used them to verify theoretical predictions about high-speed flight. Maintenance personnel learned about the unique requirements of jet engine servicing. By the early 1950s, the surviving Me-262s in Soviet hands were largely retired. They had served their purpose, providing crucial insights during a critical period of aviation development. Some were preserved in museums, where they remain to this day, as testament to both German engineering achievement and the end of the propeller era in fighter aircraft design. The story of the Soviet evaluation of the captured Me-262 illustrates several broader themes about technology, warfare, and the early Cold War period. It shows how technical intelligence gathering became a crucial activity in the post-war world, with both sides seeking to acquire and exploit enemy technological advances. It demonstrates how engineering challenges that seem purely technical often have strategic implications, and it reveals how wartime pressures can produce both brilliant innovations and serious compromises that only become apparent under more systematic peacetime analysis. The catastrophic design error discovered by Soviet engineers, the fundamental flaw in the engine mounting system, also serves as a cautionary tale about the challenges of revolutionary technological development under crisis conditions. The Me-262 represented such a leap forward that its designers were working without the accumulated experience and knowledge base that would normally guide aircraft development. They were learning as they went, and some of their solutions, while seemingly adequate at the time, proved inadequate when subjected to more thorough analysis. This pattern would repeat throughout the early jet age and beyond. New technologies often bring unexpected challenges. What seems like a reasonable engineering solution under one set of conditions may prove inadequate or dangerous under others. The systematic testing and evaluation processes that emerged in the post-war period, informed by experiences like the Me-262 analysis, helped make aviation progressively safer and more reliable. The geopolitical context of the Me-262 evaluation is also significant. The aircraft came into Soviet hands at a moment when the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and Western powers was already showing strains. Within months of Germany's surrender, the Cold War was beginning. Advanced military technology became a key element of the emerging superpower competition. The race to understand and exploit German jet technology was an early episode in this larger confrontation. Both sides were also capturing German rocket technology, with Soviet forces taking control of significant parts of the V-2 production facilities and documentation, while American forces secured key personnel like Wernher von Braun and much of his team. The pattern was similar, a scramble to acquire advanced German technology and expertise before the other side could get it. In both jet aircraft and rocketry, this captured technology provided a significant boost to post-war development programs. It's fascinating to consider how German engineers and scientists became pawns and prizes in this emerging geopolitical competition. Men who had worked for the Third Reich now found themselves courted, coerced, or compelled by the new superpowers. Their technical knowledge was too valuable to waste, and moral questions about their wartime activities were often subordinated to practical considerations about their potential contributions to new military programs. The Me-262 itself, the aircraft that Soviet engineers subjected to such thorough analysis, represents a might-have-been of military aviation history. Had circumstances been different, had development proceeded more quickly, had production not been hampered by Allied bombing and material shortages, had deployment not been delayed by political interference, the aircraft might have had a more significant impact on the war's course, but would it have been enough to change the outcome? Almost certainly not. By the time the Me-262 entered service, Germany's strategic situation was already hopeless. No single weapon system, however advanced, could have overcome the massive material and manpower advantages the Allies possessed by late 1944. Yet the Me-262's significance extends far beyond its limited wartime impact. It proved that jet propulsion was practical for combat aircraft. It demonstrated design principles that would influence aircraft development for decades. And through the process of its capture, evaluation, and analysis by former enemies, it accelerated the global transition to jet-powered aviation. The Soviet engineers who discovered the aircraft's catastrophic structural flaw were not diminishing German engineering achievement. If anything, they were demonstrating the value of systematic, thorough testing and evaluation. They were also highlighting a broader truth. Truly revolutionary technologies rarely emerge fully mature. The first examples usually contain flaws, some obvious, some hidden, that only reveal themselves through extended use and careful analysis. Modern aircraft design incorporates countless lessons learned from early jets like the Me-262. Structural testing protocols, engine mounting designs, flutter analysis, fatigue life calculations. All of these have been refined through decades of experience and sometimes through hard lessons learned from failures and near failures. The Me-262's contribution to this accumulated knowledge, both through what it got right and what it got wrong, is part of its lasting legacy. For the Soviet Union, the insights gained from evaluating captured German technology contributed to rapid advances in military capability during the early post-war years. The MiG-15, which entered the service in 1949, was one of the world's most capable fighters of its era and showed clear evidence of lessons learned from studying German jets. When MiG-15s faced American F-86 Sabres in the skies over Korea in the early 1950s, both aircraft represented the maturation of technology that had been pioneered by the Me-262 just a few years earlier. The story of the Soviet evaluation of the Me-262 is ultimately a story about the relentless march of technological progress and how knowledge spreads even in the midst of political conflict. The German engineers who designed the Me-262 were trying to give their nation a decisive advantage in a desperate war. Their work was appropriated by their victorious enemies and used to accelerate aviation development globally. Within a decade, the revolutionary technology they had pioneered had been superseded by even more advanced designs. This is the nature of military technology in the modern age. Innovations provide temporary advantages that are quickly analyzed, copied, improved upon, and ultimately surpassed. The Me-262 was revolutionary in 1944, obsolescent by 1950, and obsolete shortly thereafter. But its influence persisted in the form of knowledge gained, lessons learned, and principles established that continue to inform aviation engineering to this day. The Soviet engineers who spent months in 1945 and 1946 carefully examining captured Me-262s, documenting their discoveries and analyzing the aircraft's flaws, were participating in a process that transcended the immediate geopolitical context. They were contributing to humanity's understanding of high-speed flight, of structural dynamics, of the challenges and possibilities of jet propulsion. Their work, and the work of their counterparts in Britain and America who were conducting similar evaluations, helped make the jet age possible. Today, when we board a commercial jetliner or observe modern military aircraft conducting operations, we're benefiting from knowledge that has accumulated over 8 decades of jet aviation. The Me-262 stands at the beginning of that story, a pioneering design that got enough things right to prove the concept while containing enough flaws to provide crucial lessons for those who came after. The catastrophic design error that Soviet engineers discovered was part of the price of innovation, a reminder that being first often means making mistakes that others will learn from. The legacy of those Cold War months when Soviet engineers methodically tested and evaluated captured German jets extends far beyond the military sphere. The systematic approach to testing, the attention to structural integrity, the focus on long-term reliability, these priorities sharpened by the experience of evaluating compromised wartime designs, have influenced commercial aviation safety standards and certification processes. When modern aircraft undergo thousands of hours of testing before entering service, when structural components are designed with large safety margins and inspected regularly for signs of fatigue, these practices trace their lineage back to lessons learned in the early jet age. The Me-262 and the story of its evaluation by Soviet engineers reminds us that technological progress is rarely smooth or predictable. Breakthroughs come with unexpected challenges. Brilliant solutions in one area may create problems in another, and the full implications of new technologies often only become clear through extended use and analysis by many minds approaching problems from different angles. As the sun set on the era of propeller-driven fighters and rose on the jet age, the Me-262 stood at the threshold, a testament to human ingenuity and a cautionary example of innovation under pressure. The Soviet engineers who discovered its fatal flaw were not just identifying a problem with one aircraft. They were helping to establish the rigorous standards and systematic approaches that would make the jet age possible. Their work, done in the shadow of the emerging Cold War, contributed to the foundation of knowledge that has made modern aviation the safest and most reliable form of transportation ever devised. This is the story that Soviet engineers could tell after their months of testing and analysis. They had examined one of the war's most revolutionary weapons and found it to be both brilliant and flawed, a fitting symbol of the desperation and determination that characterized the final years of the conflict. And in discovering its flaws, they helped ensure that the jet fighters that followed would be safer, more reliable, and more capable. The Me-262's true legacy lies not in its limited wartime service, but in the lessons it taught to those who came after, lessons purchased at great cost during the war and learned in the uncertain peace that followed.